Python does support the concept of object-oriented programming. Since we discussed in the first session that Python is combination of functional programming. Functional programming is done with the help of lambda expression. So we have seen an anonymous function, which was an example of functional programming, right? Then we have structured oriented programming, that is your procedural oriented programming, and also Python supports object oriented programming. So when we talk about object oriented programming, what is the basics of object oriented programming? It simply states that everything is written inside a class and accessed by an object, right? So Python does allows you to create classes and access them with the help of objects. So let us see a simple example based on classes and objects. Okay, so to consider this, let's take an example. Let's take an example, that is, we'll create another file. Let's say this name as class example. Now what are we going to do is, in order to work with classes and objects, let's create a class first. So I'm writing the keyword class, and let's say I'm giving a class name called as employee. So I have a class which has a name called as employee. In this I have variable which is called as emp count. Okay, now similarly, what is classes? How can we define a class? Classes is a word which is derived from the word classification, which simply means to classify the following statement. Now, understanding the module of class, classes is collection of member variables and member functions or methods. So you have methods, you have variables, you have constructors, you have tons of data like objects in a single class, right? So when we talk about the classes will be having a lot of things. So classes can also have constructors, right? So whenever we want to create a constructor, we have always understand that to create a constructor, it should be same name as class name, right? So when I write employee and when I give this bracket, see, it is now giving me an error, that illegal use of variable annotations. So whenever you want to create a constructor in Python, you have to write define and you have to call init. Whenever you call hash define init, that means you are creating a constructor in Python. Okay, in Python scripting, whenever you write hash define, you are creating a constructor. Now based on this constructor, you can initialize the data. So let's say if I am initializing over here with the help of self.empid is equal to 101. That's the default data which I am trying to input. Self.empid name is equal to, let's say, demo, and self.emp salary is equal to 0. So what I am doing right now is I am just giving a default data in this default constructor. Now similarly, in order to create a parameterized constructor, you can write define, you can call the init, but when you call this init, you need to mention self and you need to mention the parameters. So let's say my parameters is employee ID, name, salary, and now you can define them by using self.employee ID is equal to employee ID, self.emp name is equal to name, and self.emp salary is equal to salary. So like this you can initialize the data. Okay, so we have two ways of initializing. One is the default constructor or default data, and one is a parameterized constructor. Okay, now whenever you are taking this data, what I'm going to do over here is I am doing emp count plus 1. I'll add one data into it. Okay, or maybe you can write plus equal to 1. So we're just including one addition. So we can get the count of employees. So self dot, or maybe instead of self you can write also employee dot emp count plus equal to 1. And let's do it over here also. Employee dot emp count is equal to plus equal to 1. Okay, now this is constructors. Now in order to create methods, in order to define methods, so we'll say define, let's say display employee is a method which will be displaying all the details of the employee. So we can write over here print emp id and we can call the id over here self dot emp id. Then let's give the name, so slash n for the new line, name self dot emp name, then salary, we'll say self dot emp salary. Okay, so this is the thing which we want to do over here. So, and I'll create one more method, define total count of employee, and this function will be having total employees and employee.emp count. So this is our simple definition of class, where I have created a class which has a default constructor, parameterized constructor, and two different methods. Okay, now in order to access this class, or in order to create the object of this class, what we can do over here is, now consider an example. If I want to call the default constructor, so I am creating object emp1 is equal to employee, and this is what I am doing. That's it. Now emp1 dot, what do you want to call? You want to call display employee method, and emp1 dot display count method. So I'm just calling this much for right now, and just run this part of code. So you may see I am getting an error which says that init requires 3 different parameters which is not available. So we are not able to call this define of init, right? Now if I just remove this for right now, or maybe let's remove this for right now and just run this code. Yeah, it is getting executed, right? That means if I am trying to call the default constructor, the default init parameters, it is not accessing. Or if I just remove this for a time being, yes, that means you cannot have 2 different init parameters at one time, right? So let's remove one from this. Now we will give parameters. Let's say the parameters is 101, name is Tracy, and the salary, let's say 35,000. And when I call emp1 dot total count of employee, it shows me total count is right now 1. Suppose if I do emp2 is equal to employee, which is 102, the name of the employee, let's say Victor, and salary, let's say 40,000. And now if I do emp2 dot display employee, then I get 2 data and the total count of employee is 2, because when we are using this class name dot variable name or object name, we are calling a static kind of data. This is why we have created like this way. We do not have use self, because when I use self, it is like a local data. But I have created this in a form of static, so it can be accessing the data into static way. Okay. So this is simple examples of writing classes or accessing classes in our Python scripting. Now you can do a lot of things by accessing. You can create getter setters. You can use the built-in data of the classes, right? So a lot of things can be done, but just to understand right now, we have just done a simple example of classes.